On the morning of July 12, 2018, emergency services received a call from an apartment block on Brisbane Street in Camberwell, South London. When paramedics arrived, they found a 17-year-old girl bleeding from a chest wound in the dimly lit communal hallway. Despite immediate medical intervention, Katrina Michal Nova was pronounced dead at the scene. Her death would expose not just the violence of one relationship, but the catastrophic failures of the systems designed to protect vulnerable young people across the United Kingdom. 6 months earlier and 5 miles west, another woman had been found lifeless in a Bromley flat, a whiteboard message scrawled nearby declaring she deserved it. Sophie Cavanaugh, 31 years old and mother of 2, had been strangled by the man she once trusted completely. These two cases, separated by geography and circumstance, share a common thread that runs through hundreds of domestic homicides each year. The question of what happens when warnings go unheeded, when pleas for help disappear into bureaucratic silence, and when love becomes indistinguishable from control. This is a story about 2 women, 2 investigations, and the long shadow cast by violence that hides in plain sight. Before we go deeper, subscribe if you love true crime documentaries, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. Katrina Michal Nova was born in London to Czech parents who had built a modest life in the capital's sprawling urban landscape. From an early age, she showed a creative spark that her family nurtured with quiet pride. Her brother Julius would later describe her as someone who could disappear into her sketchbooks for hours, perfecting the contours of a face or experimenting with color palettes that most 15-year-olds wouldn't think to explore. She was shy in the way many artists are, more comfortable expressing herself through makeup tutorials and design sketches than through words. By 2016, she had set her sights on a career in beauty, dreaming of the day she might open her own studio or work backstage at fashion shows. Her world was small but hopeful, centered around school, family, and the quiet rhythm of adolescence in a city that offered both opportunity and anonymity. That same year, Katrina stumbled across an Instagram profile that would change the trajectory of her short life. Ola Russell, known to friends and associates by the street name Capone, was 19 years old and carried himself with the kind of confidence that tends to magnetize attention. He commented on one of her posts, a simple exchange that evolved into direct messages, then phone calls, then meetings in person. To Katrina, who had spent much of her teenage years on the periphery of social circles, the attention felt intoxicating. Ola seemed worldly, self-assured, someone who saw her in a way that others didn't. Their relationship began like many do at that age, with long conversations and the thrill of being chosen. Her family noticed the change in her demeanor. She smiled more, checked her phone constantly, spoke about plans with a new energy. For a time, it seemed like a typical teenage romance, the kind that parents tolerate with mild concern and the assumption that it will run its course. But beneath the surface, warning signs were already forming. Ola had a history that extended beyond the charm he projected. He had previous convictions related to drug offenses, connections to local street networks, and a reputation that preceded him in certain parts of South London. The nickname Capone wasn't just bravado, it reflected a persona built on toughness and defiance. Katrina's family didn't know the full extent of his background at first. They saw a young man who seemed polite enough during brief encounters, someone who made their daughter happy. It wasn't until the relationship deepened and Ola's behavior began to shift that the cracks became impossible to ignore. Friends started noticing bruises on Katrina's arms, small discolorations she explained away as accidents or clumsiness. Her brother observed that she had grown quieter, more withdrawn, spending less time on her art and more time glued to her phone, as though waiting for permission to breathe. The girl who once filled sketchbooks with aspirations now seemed to be shrinking into herself. By early 2018, the relationship had crossed a line that Katrina herself recognized but felt powerless to escape. Ola had become controlling in ways both subtle and overt. He questioned her movements, demanded to know who she spoke to, and reacted with anger when she asserted any independence. The possessiveness that might have felt flattering in the beginning had transformed into surveillance. Katrina confided in friends that she felt trapped, that Ola's temper frightened her, that she didn't know how to end things without making the situation worse. It was during this period that she made the decision to reach out for help, not to family or friends alone, but to the institution she believed was equipped to intervene, the Metropolitan Police. Between February and June of 2018, Katrina contacted police on at least 5 separate occasions, each call documenting escalating violence and psychological abuse. The first report came in February, when she described an incident at Ola's flat in Camberwell. During an argument, he had retrieved a knife from the kitchen and held it close to her chest, ordering her in a low, controlled voice to stop talking to other people. Katrina was terrified, but when officers recorded her statement, no arrest was made. No follow-up visit was scheduled. The case was logged and then effectively shelved, filed away among thousands of other reports that overwhelm under-resourced police units every year. In March, she called again. This time, Ola had grabbed her arm with such force that it left visible bruising, marks that lasted for days. She told the responding officer that she felt trapped, that his behavior was escalating, and that she feared what might happen next. Once again, the response was minimal. No formal risk assessment was conducted, a procedural step that is supposed to be mandatory in cases involving domestic violence or coercive control. By April, the situation had deteriorated further. Ola tracked Katrina to a friend's house and began pounding on the door, shouting threats loud enough that neighbors considered calling the police themselves. When Katrina did call, the incident was dismissed as an isolated outburst rather than part of a pattern. The officers who took her statement failed to cross-reference it with her previous reports, a basic investigative step that might have revealed the trajectory of escalating danger. In May, Ola publicly humiliated her by throwing a drink over her in front of others, an act that signaled his willingness to assert dominance even in semi-public settings. Katrina reported this as well, explaining that she was now afraid to be alone with him. The final recorded call came on June 26, 2018, less than 2 weeks before her death. Once again, Ola had poured a drink over her during a confrontation. Once again, Katrina pleaded for help. And once again, the system failed to recognize the clear pattern of abuse unfolding in real time. What makes these failures particularly devastating is that the tools to prevent Katrina's death already existed. The DASH risk assessment model used across UK police forces to evaluate domestic abuse cases is designed precisely for situations like hers. It includes questions about escalation, control, and prior violence, and it flags high-risk cases for immediate intervention. In Katrina's case, multiple risk assessments were either never completed or were filled out so superficially that they missed every red flag. Officers also failed to investigate Ola's background thoroughly. His criminal history, his gang affiliations, and the street name that marked him as someone embedded in networks of violence were all available in police databases. Yet this information never made it into the assessment of whether Katrina was in danger. The Metropolitan Police's Child Protection Unit, responsible for safeguarding minors like Katrina, was overwhelmed with caseloads that far exceeded its capacity. Detectives and constables juggled dozens of open files simultaneously, triaging based on perceived urgency rather than procedural thoroughness. In that environment, Katrina's repeated calls became background noise, filed and forgotten. Her family noticed the toll this was taking. Julius later recalled how his sister would anxiously check her phone, flinch at unexpected sounds, and deliberately avoid certain streets in Camberwell where she might encounter Ola. She spoke about wanting to leave, about starting fresh, but the logistics felt insurmountable. Breaking up with someone who knows where you live, where you go to school, where your family resides, is not a simple decision when that person has already demonstrated a willingness to use violence. Katrina was running out of options, and the institution she had turned to for protection had offered her nothing but paperwork. By early July, she made a decision that would define the final days of her life. She resolved to end the relationship once and for all, not through phone calls or intermediaries, but by confronting Ola directly. It was an act of courage born from desperation, the kind of decision that family members look back on with both pride and unbearable sorrow. On July 11, 2018, Katrina told her family that she was done with Ola. She seemed focused, even calm, as though the decision had lifted a weight she had been carrying for months. She didn't share the specifics of how she planned to end things, only that she intended to make it clear that their relationship was over. The next day, she traveled to the apartment block on Brisbane Street where Ola was living. The building itself was typical of South London social housing, a mid-rise structure with narrow hallways and thin walls that offered little privacy. Katrina and Ola met in one of the communal areas, a space used by residents for storing bikes or waiting for elevators. What began as a conversation quickly escalated into an argument. Witnesses who lived in the building later described hearing raised voices echoing through the stairwell, though none intervened at the time. The exact sequence of events inside that hallway remains subject to interpretation. What is known from forensic evidence and witness testimony is that Katrina was carrying a kitchen knife in her bag. The knife measured 19.5 centimeters in length, a standard household blade that she had likely brought out of fear for her safety. There is no evidence that Katrina had ever used a weapon before, no prior incidents suggesting she was prone to violence. The most plausible explanation, supported by interviews with friends, is that she carried the knife as a precaution, unsure of how Ola would react to being told the relationship was over. During the confrontation, a physical struggle ensued. Reports differ on whether Katrina stumbled or was pushed, but the result was catastrophic. When she fell, the knife in her bag pierced through the fabric and struck her in the chest. The wound was deep and immediate, cutting into tissue and vessels in a way that left little room for survival. Ola, according to his own account given later to police, reacted by pressing his hands against the wound and shouting for help. Neighbors who heard the commotion called emergency services, and paramedics arrived within minutes. They found Katrina lying in the hallway, her shirt soaked with blood, Ola kneeling beside her. Despite efforts to stabilize her, she was pronounced dead at the scene. The knife, which had come from her own bag, was recovered and logged as evidence. Ola was arrested on suspicion of murder and taken into custody for questioning. The investigation that followed was both swift and complex. Forensic experts confirmed that the knife belonged to Katrina, not Ola. Witnesses corroborated that the altercation had been mutual, with raised voices and physical contact on both sides. There was no evidence that Ola had brought a weapon or that he had intended to kill Katrina. DNA analysis showed no indication that he had handled the knife before it struck her. These findings placed the case in a legal gray area that prosecutors would struggle to navigate. On one hand, Katrina was dead as a direct result of a confrontation involving Ola. On the other, the evidence suggested that her death had been accidental, the tragic outcome of a struggle rather than a premeditated act of violence. The decision was made to charge Ola with manslaughter rather than murder, a distinction that carries significant legal implications. Murder requires proof of intent to kill or cause serious harm. Manslaughter, by contrast, applies to deaths that occur during unlawful acts without the intent to kill. In Ola's case, the prosecution argued that his aggressive behavior and history of violence had created the conditions that led to Katrina's death, even if he had not intended to kill her in that specific moment. For Katrina's family, the charge felt like a betrayal. Julius described the decision as yet another failure in a long chain of failures that had defined his sister's final months. The police had ignored her calls for help while she was alive, and now the legal system was reducing her death to a technicality. The grief was compounded by anger, a sense that Katrina's life had been devalued at every stage. As the case moved toward trial, investigators also began examining the systemic failures that had left Katrina vulnerable in the first place. The Independent Office for Police Conduct launched an inquiry into how the Metropolitan Police had handled her reports between February and June. What they uncovered was a portrait of institutional dysfunction that extended far beyond one individual case. The investigation revealed that 12 officers had some level of involvement in Katrina's case, from the constables who took her initial statements to the supervisors who reviewed and filed the reports. Of those 12, 2 were singled out for formal disciplinary hearings. Police Constable Sophie Dennis admitted during the proceedings that she had falsified a report following one of Katrina's complaints. Specifically, Dennis claimed in her paperwork that she had conducted a follow-up with Katrina, when in fact, no such follow-up had occurred. On June 26th, when Ola publicly poured a drink over Katrina, Dennis again failed to complete a required risk assessment. Her actions, or lack thereof, were a direct violation of protocol designed to protect domestic abuse victims. Police Constable Carrie Lineham faced similar scrutiny for her handling of another of Katrina's reports. Lineham acknowledged that she had not escalated the case as she should have, though she stopped short of admitting full responsibility. Both officers received official warnings and remedial training, but for Katrina's family, the punishment felt inadequate given the stakes involved. The broader investigation uncovered systemic issues that extended beyond individual misconduct. The Metropolitan Police's domestic abuse response units were chronically underfunded and understaffed, a problem that had persisted for years despite repeated warnings from advocacy groups and internal reviews. Officers were handling caseloads that exceeded reasonable limits, often juggling dozens of active cases simultaneously. In that environment, procedural shortcuts became the norm. Risk assessments were completed hastily or skipped entirely. Follow-up visits were postponed indefinitely. Information sharing between units was inconsistent, meaning that patterns of abuse often went undetected, even when victims reported multiple incidents. Katrina's case fell through these cracks, not because of one person's negligence, but because the system itself was structurally incapable of providing the protection it promised. In September 2020, a coroner's inquest at South London Coroner's Court examined the circumstances of Katrina's death in detail. Coroner Andrew Harris delivered a verdict that was both damning and specific. He ruled Katrina's death an unlawful killing, a legal classification that stops short of naming a culprit, but acknowledges that her death resulted from unlawful conduct. Harris went further, stating explicitly that the Metropolitan Police's delayed and inadequate response had significantly worsened the tragedy. He noted that officers were aware of Ola's violent history and Katrina's repeated reports of escalating abuse, yet failed to act in a manner consistent with their duty of care. The coroner's report included several recommendations aimed at preventing similar failures in the future. These included mandatory risk assessments for all domestic abuse reports, improved training for frontline officers, and better information sharing protocols across police units. The Metropolitan Police issued a public apology in response to the inquest, acknowledging their failures and committing to reform. They announced a pilot program to create specialized response teams dedicated exclusively to domestic violence cases, with officers trained specifically in recognizing patterns of coercive control and escalation. Whether these reforms would have saved Katrina's life is a question that her family will never stop asking. What is certain is that the institutional failures she encountered were not unique. Across the United Kingdom, domestic abuse victims report similar experiences of being ignored, dismissed, or told that their concerns do not meet the threshold for intervention. Studies conducted in the wake of high-profile cases like Katrina have shown that a significant percentage of domestic homicide victims had contacted police multiple times before their deaths. The gap between policy and practice remains wide, a testament to the challenges of translating good intentions into effective action. While the systemic investigation unfolded, the legal case against Ola Rawasl moved forward. On January 9, 2019, he appeared before Suffolk Crown Court to face charges of manslaughter. The courtroom was filled with Katrina's family and friends, many wearing photographs of her pinned to their clothing. The defense argued that Ola had never intended to harm Katrina, that the knife belonged to her, and that her death had been a tragic accident during a mutual altercation. They presented DNA evidence showing that Ola had not handled the knife before it struck Katrina, and they emphasized witness testimony describing the argument as heated but mutual. The prosecution countered by highlighting Ola's history of violence and control, pointing to the 5 police reports Katrina had filed in the months leading up to her death. They argued that even if Ola had not intended to kill her in that specific moment, his pattern of abusive behavior had created the conditions that made her death inevitable. On January 29, 2019, Judge Nicholas Lorraine Smith sentenced Ola to 3 years and 3 months in prison. The sentence was based on sentencing guidelines for manslaughter, which allow for significant variation depending on the circumstances of the case. The judge explained that because there was no clear evidence of intent to kill, and because the knife had belonged to Katrina, the sentence could not approach the length typically associated with murder convictions. For Katrina's family, the sentence was a devastating blow. Julia stood in the courtroom gallery and described it as a cruel injustice. Barely 2 years for a life taken. The family's local Member of Parliament, Harriet Harman, wrote to the Solicitor General arguing that the sentence was unduly lenient and should be reviewed. In March 2019, Katrina's family formally appealed the sentence, hoping for a harsher penalty. Solicitor General Robert Buckland reviewed the case but ultimately upheld the original ruling, stating that the sentence aligned with legal standards for manslaughter without intent. He acknowledged the family's heartbreak, but noted that the evidence left the court with limited options under existing law. Ola's story did not end with his release from prison. In 2020, after serving his sentence, he was freed and returned to South London. Less than 2 years later, on May 20th, 2022, he assaulted another woman. Lisa Cuba was attacked in Hounslow, West London, where Ola grabbed her by the neck and struck her in the face with a set of moped keys, leaving a deep gash above her eye. He was arrested, charged with assault causing actual bodily harm, and sentenced at Kingston Crown Court on July 8, 2022, to 3 years and 3 months in prison, along with a 10-year restraining order. The pattern was unmistakable. Despite his conviction for Katrina's death, despite the coroner's damning verdict, despite the promises of reform and rehabilitation, Ola had returned to violence. For those who had followed Katrina's case, the news was both horrifying and predictable. It underscored a fundamental question about the criminal justice system, its ability to prevent repeat offenders from causing further harm. Katrina's death left scars that extended far beyond her immediate family. Friends who had urged her to leave Ola struggled with guilt, wondering if they could have done more. Teachers and mentors who had watched her talent blossom mourned the future she would never realize. Advocacy groups working to combat domestic violence cited her case as emblematic of systemic failures that persist despite decades of awareness campaigns and policy initiatives. The broader implications of Katrina's story touch on issues that are both legal and cultural. The UK's approach to domestic abuse has evolved significantly over the past 2 decades, with new laws recognizing coercive control as a criminal offence and increased funding for victim support services. Yet the gap between policy and practice remains stubbornly wide. Frontline officers often lack the training and resources to implement these policies effectively. Victims face barriers ranging from fear of retaliation to distrust of institutions that have failed them before. And perpetrators, even when convicted, often receive sentences that do not reflect the severity of their actions or the likelihood of reoffending. Katrina's case also raises uncomfortable questions about age and vulnerability. At 17, she was legally a minor, yet the systems designed to protect children often fail to recognize that young people in abusive relationships face unique challenges. The dynamics of teenage relationships, the influence of social media, and the developmental realities of adolescence all complicate efforts to intervene effectively. Katrina's repeated calls for help should have triggered immediate protective measures, yet she was treated as one case among thousands, a file to be processed rather than a person in danger. Her story is a reminder that behind every statistic about domestic violence is an individual whose life was cut short by failures that were entirely preventable. 6 months before Katrina's death, and 5 miles to the west, another tragedy was unfolding in the borough of Bromley. Sophie Cavanaugh, 31 years old and mother of 2 young children, was found dead in a flat on Chatterton Road on the evening of May 20th, 2018. Her body was discovered under a duvet in the bedroom, her mobile phone smashed and discarded in the kitchen bin. Scrawled across a children's whiteboard in the corner of the room was a message that would become central to the investigation. She deserved it. My baby, my princess and I can now be together forever. We will have the love and happiness we deserve. The words were chilling, a mix of affection and blame that revealed a mind consumed by obsession and delusion. The man responsible for those words and for Sophie's death was her ex-husband, Martin Cavanaugh. The case that followed would expose another dimension of domestic violence, one characterized not by sudden escalation, but by slow, suffocating control that persists long after a relationship has legally ended. Sophie met Martin in 2008 at a bar in Elmer's End, Bromley. She was 24, full of warmth and energy, someone who lit up rooms without trying. Martin, 28 at the time, seemed charming and attentive, qualities that drew Sophie in quickly. According to her half-sister Lucy Larkin, the two connected instantly, bonding over shared interests and a sense of humor that made their early days together feel effortless. By 2011, they were married and settled in southeast London, building a life that from the outside appeared stable and content. Sophie's joy came most fully alive when she became a mother. She adored her children with a devotion that her family described as angelic, pouring her energy into their care and creating a home filled with warmth and laughter. For a time, the marriage seemed to work. Martin was employed, the household functioned, and the children thrived under Sophie's attentive care. But beneath the surface, cracks had begun to form. Martin's personality, which had seemed confident and assertive in the early days of their relationship, gradually revealed itself as controlling and possessive. He monitored Sophie's movements, questioned her friendships, and reacted with anger when she asserted independence. The jealousy that might have seemed flattering initially became oppressive, a constant surveillance that left Sophie feeling trapped. Friends and family noticed changes in her demeanor. She became quieter, more hesitant, as though constantly calculating the consequences of her words and actions. The laughter that had once come easily grew rarer, replaced by a weariness that Lucy later described as drained and low. By December 2016, Sophie had reached her breaking point. She told Martin that their marriage was over and initiated the separation. The legal dissolution of their relationship, however, did not end Martin's grip on her life. Even after the separation, Sophie and Martin continued to see each other regularly for the sake of their children. They coordinated pickups and drop-offs, attended school events together, and occasionally spent time as a family unit to maintain some semblance of stability for the kids. To outsiders, it might have appeared that they were successfully co-parenting, managing the complexities of divorce with maturity and mutual respect. But behind closed doors, Martin's behavior told a different story. He refused to accept that the relationship was truly over. He sent Sophie messages declaring that he wanted to have her one last time, proposals that blurred the line between affection and coercion. When Sophie began exploring new relationships, Martin's possessiveness intensified. He would send intimidating messages to men Sophie was dating, warning them to stay away or face consequences. He bombarded Sophie with texts and calls, oscillating between declarations of love and accusations of betrayal. Lucy later testified that Sophie seemed increasingly worn down by Martin's constant intrusion into her life, unable to fully move forward because he refused to let go. On May 19, 2018, Sophie and Martin spent the day together in what appeared to be a routine family outing. They took their two children to Wingham Wildlife Park in Kent, a popular destination for families that offered a wholesome setting for co-parenting. The day seemed pleasant, the children enjoyed seeing the animals, and Sophie and Martin interacted without obvious tension. Later that evening, they met friends at the Chatterton Arms, a bar in Bromley Common, where they shared drinks and conversation. Witnesses later described the atmosphere as relaxed, with no signs of the violence that would erupt hours later. Phone records show that Sophie was online chatting and browsing social media until shortly after midnight, a detail that suggests she was not immediately in distress. But investigators would later piece together evidence suggesting that Martin's obsession with Sophie had been building to a dangerous crescendo. According to testimony given during the trial, Martin had recently offered Sophie £100 to sleep with him one last time. She had firmly rejected the offer, a decision that appears to have fueled his anger and desperation. That night, Sophie went to Martin's flat on Chatterton Road, a place he had been renting for only 2 months. She did not live there, and her mother, Dawn Larkin, later stated that she had no idea Sophie planned to visit. What happened inside that flat remains partially obscured, but investigators were able to construct a likely sequence of events based on forensic evidence, text messages, and the scene itself. Martin had been sending Sophie angry messages in the days leading up to her death, accusing her of making things worse by seeing other men and blaming her for the disintegration of their family. His fixation on control, on possessing Sophie in a way that transcended their legal separation, had become all-consuming. Sometime between late Saturday night and the early hours of Sunday, May 20th, Martin strangled Sophie. The court could not determine with certainty whether the killing happened in a sudden outburst or after a prolonged struggle, but the forensic evidence was clear. Sophie had died from compression of the neck. She was found in the bedroom of the flat, her body covered with a blanket. Her mobile phone had been smashed and discarded in the kitchen bin, evidence suggesting someone had tried to destroy it. The children's whiteboard propped against the wall carried Martin's message, a twisted justification that framed Sophie's death as both deserved punishment and romantic reunion. After killing Sophie, Martin did not remain at the flat. At approximately 8:10 in the morning, he brought their children to his mother's home in Beckenham, asking her to watch them for a couple of hours. Witnesses later recalled that he appeared agitated, shouting to be let inside. After dropping off the children, he left without explaining where he was going or when he would return. Police were called to the Chatterton Road flat at 6:13 in the evening on May 20th, 2018, after reports that a woman had been found dead. When officers arrived, they discovered Sophie's body under the duvet, the smashed phone, and the chilling whiteboard message. The scene was processed methodically, with forensic teams photographing every detail and collecting evidence that would later prove crucial in court. A post-mortem examination conducted on May 22nd confirmed that Sophie had died from strangulation. With that confirmation, Detective Chief Inspector Richard Vandenberg of the Metropolitan Police's Homicide and Major Crime Command launched a full murder investigation. Initially, Sophie's death had been treated as unexplained, but the mounting evidence quickly pointed toward Martin as the primary suspect. Police issued a public appeal on May 23rd, urging anyone with information about Martin's whereabouts to come forward. Authorities warned the public not to approach him, noting his connections to southeast London and the south coast, particularly Paignton. Martin's Audi was seized for forensic examination, and neighbours were interviewed about his behaviour in the weeks leading up to Sophie's death. Edward Basting, a neighbour in the apartment block, described Martin as quiet and mentioned that they had only exchanged greetings in passing. On May 24th, Martin surrendered himself at Bromley police station. When taken into custody, he was found carrying Sophie's bank cards and had a fresh injury to his wrist, likely sustained during an attempt to flee or in the aftermath of the killing. Investigators pieced together the timeline of events using phone records, witness testimony, and forensic analysis of the flat. The case against Martin Cavanaugh was formally heard at the Old Bailey in November 2018, 6 months after Sophie's death. The trial lasted several days, with prosecutors presenting a detailed account of Martin's controlling behavior, his refusal to accept the end of the marriage, and the obsessive messages he had sent Sophie in the weeks before her death. Prosecutor Alexandra Healy highlighted text messages in which Martin accused Sophie of seeing other men, using language that revealed his possessive and jealous mindset. The whiteboard message found at the scene became a focal point of the prosecution's case, a chilling window into Martin's distorted perception of their relationship. Martin's defense team argued that he had acted in self-defense, claiming that Sophie had struck him after they had used cocaine together and that he had held her by the neck for only 10 to 15 seconds. The jury rejected this account. On December 7, 2018, after just 4 hours of deliberation, they found Martin guilty of murder. Sophie's family wept as the verdict was delivered. The evidence, which included the whiteboard message, the shattered phone, and the autopsy confirming strangulation, had left little room for doubt. On December 10th, Judge Nicholas Lorraine Smith sentenced Martin to life in prison with a minimum term of 16 years. The judge stated that Martin's crime stemmed from an overwhelming need for control and highlighted the whiteboard message as a chilling reflection of his mindset. He noted that Sophie's death was the culmination of months of obsessive behavior and that Martin had shown no genuine remorse for his actions. Sophie's mother, Dawn, spoke tearfully outside the courthouse, describing her daughter as an angel taken too soon and expressing hope that the verdict would bring some measure of justice. For the family, the sentence offered a degree of closure, though the loss of Sophie remained an open wound that would never fully heal. Sophie's case, like Katrina's, raises difficult questions about the nature of domestic violence and the systems designed to prevent it. Unlike Katrina, Sophie never reported Martin's behavior to police before her death. There were no formal calls for help, no documented incidents that might have triggered intervention. Yet her family and friends were acutely aware of Martin's controlling nature. Lucy Larkin testified that Martin would harass Sophie's potential new partners and make her life unbearable whenever she tried to move on. His behavior was an obvious warning sign, yet it never reached the attention of authorities. This speaks to a broader challenge in addressing domestic abuse. Many victims do not report their experiences, either because they fear retaliation, distrust the police, or believe that the system cannot help them. Sophie's silence before her death was not an indication that she was safe, but rather a reflection of the complex dynamics that keep victims trapped even after legal separation. The parallels between Katrina's and Sophie's cases are striking. Both women were killed by men who could not accept the end of a relationship. Both faced escalating patterns of control and violence that were visible to those around them. Both died in circumstances that might have been prevented if the systems designed to protect them had functioned as intended. Yet the differences are also instructive. Katrina reached out for help repeatedly, filing 5 police reports in 4 months, and was still let down by institutional failures. Sophie never filed a report, yet her death might have been prevented if there had been better mechanisms for identifying and intervening in cases of post-separation abuse. Together, their stories illuminate the multifaceted nature of domestic violence and the diverse ways that systems fail to protect vulnerable individuals. The legacy of these 2 cases extends beyond the courtroom verdicts and the disciplinary hearings. They have become touchstones in ongoing debates about how the United Kingdom addresses domestic violence, particularly in cases involving young women and post-separation control. Advocacy groups have used Katrina's case to push for mandatory risk assessments and better training for police officers. Sophie's case has been cited in discussions about the need for support services that continue after relationships end, recognizing that separation often increases rather than decreases the risk of violence. Legislative changes in the years following these deaths have included stronger protections for victims of coercive control and increased funding for specialist domestic abuse units. Whether these reforms will translate into meaningful change remains an open question, one that future cases will continue to test. For the families left behind, the pain of loss is compounded by the knowledge that these deaths were preventable. Julius Michal Nova has spoken publicly about his sister's case, advocating for systemic reform and honoring Katrina's memory by demanding accountability. Dawn Larkin and Lucy Larkin have similarly kept Sophie's story alive, participating in campaigns aimed at raising awareness about the warning signs of domestic abuse and the importance of early intervention. Their advocacy is driven by grief, but also by determination, a refusal to let their loved ones become just another statistic in the grim calculus of domestic homicides. The ripple effects of these deaths touch not only the immediate families, but also the communities they were part of, the professionals who failed them, and the broader society that continues to grapple with the question of how to protect those most vulnerable to violence. The broader cultural and legal landscape in which these cases unfolded is shaped by decades of evolving attitudes toward domestic violence. In the 1970s and 80s, domestic abuse was often dismissed as a private matter, something to be resolved within families rather than addressed by the state. The feminist movement of that era played a crucial role in reframing domestic violence as a public issue, one that required legal intervention and social support. By the early 2000s, the UK had enacted legislation such as the Domestic Violence Crime and Victims Act, which expanded protections for victims and created new criminal offences related to coercive control. The introduction of the Domestic Abuse Act in 2021 further strengthened these protections, establishing a legal definition of domestic abuse that includes economic, psychological, and emotional harm. Despite these legal advances, implementation remains uneven. Police forces across the UK vary widely in their response to domestic abuse reports, with some regions investing heavily in specialised units, while others struggle with chronic underfunding. The Metropolitan Police, which handled both Katrina's and Sophie's cases, is the largest police force in the UK and faces unique challenges related to the scale and diversity of the population it serves. Budget cuts imposed through austerity measures in the 2010s significantly reduced the force's capacity, leading to stretched resources and overworked officers. These structural issues are not excuses for the failures that occurred, but they provide context for understanding why systemic breakdowns happen even when policies are in place. The psychological dimensions of domestic violence also warrant deeper examination. Perpetrators like Ola Razzle and Martin Cavanaugh exhibit patterns of behavior that researchers have identified as central to abusive relationships: the need for control, intense jealousy, an inability to accept rejection, and a tendency to blame victims for their own suffering. These patterns are not random or spontaneous. They are learned behaviors that can be unlearned with intervention. Yet the UK's approach to addressing perpetrator behavior remains underdeveloped compared to victim support services. Programs aimed at rehabilitating offenders exist, but they are often underfunded and poorly integrated into the criminal justice system. Ola's reoffending after his release is a stark reminder that incarceration alone does not address the underlying attitudes and behaviors that drive violence. Victims of domestic violence face a complex set of barriers that extend beyond the immediate threat of physical harm. Economic dependence, fear of losing custody of children, social stigma, and distrust of institutions all contribute to the difficulty of leaving abusive relationships. For young women like Katrina, these barriers are compounded by developmental factors. At 17, she was navigating the transition from adolescence to adulthood, a period characterized by identity formation and increased independence. Her relationship with Ola, which began when she was 15, shaped her understanding of what relationships should look like. The control he exerted became normalized over time, making it harder for her to recognize the abuse and seek help. For Sophie, the barriers were different but equally significant. As a mother of two, she was navigating the complexities of co-parenting with a man who refused to let go. The societal expectation that divorced parents should maintain amicable relationships for the sake of their children created pressure on Sophie to tolerate Martin's behavior even after their marriage had ended. The role of technology in modern domestic abuse is another dimension that both cases highlight. Social media platforms, messaging apps, and mobile phones have become tools of surveillance and harassment for many abusers. Ola used Instagram to initiate contact with Katrina, and later used messaging to monitor her movements and interactions. Martin sent Sophie a barrage of texts and messages that oscillated between declarations of love and accusations of betrayal. The ease with which abusers can maintain contact with their victims through digital means complicates efforts to enforce boundaries and restraining orders. Law enforcement agencies have been slow to adapt to this reality, often lacking the resources or expertise to investigate digital harassment effectively. The smashed phone found in Sophie's case is a stark reminder of how perpetrators use technology both to control and to conceal evidence. Public awareness of domestic violence has increased significantly in recent years, driven by high-profile cases, media coverage, and advocacy campaigns. The Me Too movement, while primarily focused on sexual harassment and assault, has also contributed to broader conversations about power, control, and gendered violence. In the UK, organisations such as Women's Aid and Refuge have played crucial roles in providing support to victims and lobbying for legislative change. Yet awareness alone does not translate into protection. The gap between public understanding of domestic violence and the lived reality of victims remains wide. Many people still struggle to recognize the early warning signs of abusive relationships, and myths persist about what constitutes abuse and who is at risk. The belief that domestic violence only happens in certain communities, or that it is always accompanied by physical injuries, prevents many victims from identifying their own experiences as abuse. The economic costs of domestic violence are staggering. A 2017 study estimated that domestic abuse costs the UK economy approximately £66 billion annually when accounting for healthcare, criminal justice, lost productivity, and victim support services. These figures understate the true cost, which includes the immeasurable toll of trauma, grief, and lost potential. Every death like Katrina's and Sophie's represents not only a personal tragedy, but also a societal failure, a reminder that prevention is both morally imperative and economically rational. Investing in frontline services, training police officers, funding perpetrator programs, and supporting victims would save lives and reduce costs in the long term. Yet these investments require political will and sustained commitment, resources that are often diverted to other priorities. The international context also provides valuable lessons. Countries such as Spain and Australia have implemented comprehensive national strategies to combat domestic violence, with coordinated efforts across healthcare, education, law enforcement, and social services. Spain's gender violence courts, established in 2004, provide specialized legal proceedings for domestic abuse cases, ensuring that judges and prosecutors have the expertise to handle these complex situations. Australia's national plan to reduce violence against women and children includes public awareness campaigns, school-based education programs, and significant funding for victim support services. The UK can learn from these models, adapting successful strategies to its own legal and cultural context. The key is to move beyond reactive responses to individual cases and toward proactive, systemic approaches that address the root causes of domestic violence. The stories of Katrina Michal Nova and Sophie Cavanaugh are not isolated tragedies. They are part of a larger pattern that claims the lives of dozens of women each year in the UK alone. According to data from the Office for National Statistics, an average of 2 women per week are killed by a current or former partner in England and Wales. These deaths are often the culmination of months or years of escalating abuse, a trajectory that is predictable and preventable if the right interventions occur. The challenge lies in translating this knowledge into effective action, ensuring that every report is taken seriously, every risk is assessed thoroughly, and every victim receives the protection they need. The families of Katrina and Sophie continue to fight for that future, honoring the memories of the women they loved by demanding that no other family endure the same pain. As the years pass since these deaths, the names Katrina Michal Nova and Sophie Cavanaugh have become more than just entries in court records or statistics in government reports. They are symbols of both the failures of the past and the possibilities for the future. Their stories remind us that behind every case of domestic violence is a person with dreams, relationships, and a future that was stolen. They challenge us to ask uncomfortable questions about the systems we rely on to protect the vulnerable and to demand more than apologies and promises of reform. They call us to action, to recognize that preventing domestic violence is not the responsibility of any single institution, but a collective obligation that requires vigilance, compassion, and an unwavering commitment to justice. In the end, the legacy of Katrina and Sophie will be measured not by the sentences handed down to those who killed them, but by the lives saved through the reforms their deaths inspired and the societal transformation their stories continue to demand.